So gear doesn't matter, right? I'm sure you've heard that 1,000 times, except sometimes gear really does matter. So like I said, I'm sure you've heard 1,000 times gear doesn't matter. And the reason you've heard that is mostly because it's true. Gear really doesn't matter. And one of the other reasons maybe is because gear can be kind of an equalizer. If you have somebody who's a 30-year veteran of shooting and they started out in film in a dark room and now they've got the big $6,000, $10,000 expensive setup and they're shooting, and somebody who is just starting out in photography who's just got a lot of money can stand right next to them with the exact same gear. And, the guy who's been shooting forever will feel like gear doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because that photographer has been doing it a long time. They have experience. And they kind of also want to feel like, this guy who just started out can't take the kind of shots that I do because he just doesn't have the experience. And, the veteran photographer can get better shots from an entry-level DSLR or point-and-shoot camera than somebody who really has no idea what they're doing with a big, expensive camera. And for the most part, that's true. So the really, one aspect of why gear doesn't matter is because experience matters, and, creativity, natural creativity or earned creativity is more valuable than, an actual difference in gear. Another reason is because, there really aren't huge differences between, for the most part, an f4 lens and an f2.8 lens. I know you can look at them and you can, dig in and see the different, shallow depths of field in certain situations, and some lenses are sharper than others, and some cameras give you more, a better color than others, and there are differences there, definitely, but for the most part, there really isn't enough of a difference to really make a difference. Again, it's going to come down to the work and dedication that a photographer is putting into their craft. That's what's really going to make the difference. So yeah, I'm shooting here on the Canon M50, which is really a great camera, especially for the money, and in ideal situations, it holds its own against a super pro mirrorless or DSLR camera. It holds its own against that. So you can have varying levels of expensive or inexpensive gear, great gear versus gear that's not so great, and you can end up with similar enough results that it really doesn't matter in those situations. But there are times when gear really does matter. So when you talk about camera gear, basically, for a photographer, it's the tool that they're using to create their art. It's just something that is, just like a painter has a paintbrush and a canvas, a sculptor has a big rock and a chisel. I don't really know sculpting. I'm assuming that's what they have. A photographer has a camera, and that's the means by which they take the vision that's in their head. It's not what's in front of them that they're trying to capture. It's the vision that they have in their head, whether they thought of it before and they went out looking for it, or they just, it came to them in that situation. They're using that tool to create the image. So the camera is really just a tool, and it's the job of the tool to kind of not interfere with what the artist is trying to do. So if I'm out there and I'm trying to capture this image, the camera that I'm using has to not get in my way. The camera that I'm using has to allow me to be creative and do the things that I need to do. It's just a tool. It's a means to an end. But there's times when the camera can actually free up a lot of the work or thinking that a photographer has to do to allow them to be more creative, to allow them to not have to worry about maybe some technical stuff and actually be creative and work on their art. So going back, decades, let's say, auto exposure system, I think was maybe in the 50s, in the 1950s, that the auto exposure system first really, took on. And, that eliminated, for photographers, that eliminated them having to figure out the exposure beforehand. I know you still had to kind of know what your exposure was going to be, make sure that, there wasn't a highlight that was going to throw it off or a dark spot that was going to throw off the auto exposure. But being able to use auto exposure 50, 60 years ago, whatever it was, actually took the burden off of the shoulders of the photographers while they were trying to be creative. Same thing goes for autofocus. I think that was probably like in the 70s that the autofocus system really took hold. And it was the same thing. Rather than having to worry about, looking through and getting the focus just right, and maybe it was off a little bit, you can not worry about that. So now you're in the 1980s and you've got autofocus and auto exposure, and you can just go out there with your camera and the camera will take care of that technical part of it that you don't really need to worry about anymore. And then obviously, I think the biggest advancement, the biggest difference in camera gear ever is really the advent of digital cameras. When we started using digital cameras, it takes away, not that they're better than film cameras, because there are still people shooting with film cameras who do a great job. And it takes away a huge part of the learning curve. When you were shooting film back in the day, even if you were having your photos processed, you're doing it yourself that same day, or you were getting them processed by a lab that same day, the feedback time was just enormous. You could be out there shooting and thinking you're doing a great job, and then you look at your photos and maybe not so much. And now let's write down maybe what we did while we're doing it, and look at our photos and realize what we did wrong, and go out and try to do it better next time. And the learning curve is just enormous. So when digital came along, you had the instant feedback. You had the ability to learn in the moment and adjust and create. You snap a picture and you look at it and it's overexposed. Why is it overexposed? Well, because half the scene was dark and it fooled the auto exposure, and you ended up with an image that was overexposed. Okay, adjust that down a couple of stops, get your photo done within seconds. Done. Same thing goes for anything, even just framing and composition. You take a shot and you look at it on the back of your camera and it doesn't look the way I thought it was going to look. Let me work the scene. Let me keep going with it. And you can really, learn a lot in a really short amount of time with digital photography. And I think, so that's really a huge, advancement where gear really does matter. Where, if somebody was starting out with a digital camera versus somebody starting out with a film camera, the person with the same amount of dedication and desire to pursue photography, the person with the digital camera is going to be able to learn and adjust a lot more quickly than the person with the film camera will. Again, in the end, they may end up in the same place, but for the learning part of it, digital makes a huge difference. So I think now we're on to what I find a huge breakthrough or milestone in camera gear advancement, which is the eye detect autofocus. I've been using it on the Canon R5 for a while now, since I got it back in October 2020, and it's been amazing. I mean, absolutely amazing, in that it takes away part of the distraction for me, for the photographer, in situations where you're trying to shoot portraits or you're trying to shoot sports. And you have to worry about where your focus point is. You have to worry about, or if the subject is moving a little bit. You have to make sure you have your focus point right. You're focusing on the eye. The eye is obviously the most important part. You want to keep that in focus. And part of shooting portraits, let's say, or events or weddings or anything like that, is you had to make sure that you had the focus point, especially if you're shooting wide aperture stuff, wide open, where your depth of field is really shallow, or also if your subject is moving a little bit, especially kids and things like that, who maybe don't sit still. Part of the trial and error of getting those shots is making sure your focus point is in. So you go through a whole session and you take 100 photos, and 20 or 30 of them might be out of focus just because the subject was moving, you moved a little bit, you didn't have the focus point in the right spot, so those are gone. And you still may work out fine, but now you don't have to worry about it. If the eye detect autofocus is working, and I'm telling you, the Canon R5 has amazing eye detect autofocus. I know Sony does also. The Nikon cameras, I think, really doing a great job also of detecting the eye and tracking it. And as you're taking the shots, the camera is following the eye around. Even if the person's walking around or moving, you don't have to worry about it. You can even actually come out from behind the camera and interact with your subject while you're shooting. The framing might be off a little bit, but while you're still shooting them, interact with them and be continuously getting shots, and not having to say, okay, stop, I got to adjust a little bit, make sure I adjust my focus point, I have it there. You don't have to worry about it. So it takes a huge part of the thinking and the technical part of it out of shooting, especially portraits, and sports and things like that. It takes a huge part of the technical part of it out, and it lets you be more creative. It lets you work the scene a little bit better. It takes away that part of it. So, advancing through all these years, you have things like autofocus, now the eye detect autofocus and auto exposure, and being able to shoot digitally, where now a lot of the things that you'd have to think about, the technical stuff you would have had to think about before, you don't have to think about it anymore. It's off your plate. It's not that the camera's doing it for you, it's that the camera's not inhibiting you from doing it. Okay, think about it as if, basically you're seeing a scene, you're seeing a portrait, you're seeing a landscape, whatever it is, and you're seeing it with your eye. And your eye, in combination with your brain, is able to do some amazing things as far as looking at keeping something in focus, and creating the right exposure and everything. It all happens automatically, in the contacts between your eyes and your brain. But your camera, the limitations of the camera before would get in the way of that. The camera can't necessarily focus on whatever you want it to focus on. The camera can't necessarily know what the exposure is supposed to be. Now it's not doing it for you, it's getting out of your way. The camera is getting out of your way and letting you be more creative and not have to worry about that technical stuff. So again, gear doesn't matter as much as experience and dedication and all of those things. But there are instances where if you're looking at two cameras and one of them has eye detect autofocus and the other one doesn't, that makes a difference. In my opinion, that makes a huge difference, more than the quality of the lens or the actual size of the sensor and things like that. Being able to actually not have to worry about some of the technical stuff, to me, makes a huge difference. So let me know what you think about that. If there's any other huge, things in photography that really do make a difference as far as gear goes, let me know what you think. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of other things that really do make a big difference as far as gear goes. Let me know in the comments below. Any questions that you have, put them down in the comments below also. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time.